Are you coming to the tree with a strung up a man? Are you coming to the tree with a strung up a man? This ain't murder 3. Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkansas Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm Chris James, your host. This is season number 2, episode 33. If you were all wrapped up in that last podcast, the one about the strange creatures, and you want to hear the rest of the show, simply go to strangethings.podomatic.com and you can find all of the archives there. And it's free. The Sargasso Sea. Tonight's show, we're going to be looking into that as well as a little to do with the Bermuda Triangle, since the two kind of share some real estate. But first, before we get going, let's take a look at one of the most misunderstood ghost ship stories ever told. If you watched the series of movies called The Pirates of the Caribbean, Part 1 through, I don't know what they're up to now, 27, you'll have seen a character played by Bill Nighy. Davy Jones, captain of the Flying Dutchman. No. Davy Jones was not the captain of any ship, and definitely not the captain of that particular ghost ship. Davy Jones is the owner and proprietor of Davy Jones' Locker, and is an idiom for the bottom of the sea. The state of death among drowning sailors and shipwrecks. It is used as a euphemism for drowning or shipwrecks in which the sailors and ships' remains are consigned to the bottom of the sea, as in to be sent to Davy Jones' Locker. The earliest known reference to the negative connotation of Davy Jones occurred in the 4 Years' Voyage of Captain George Roberts by the author Daniel Defoe, published in 1726 in London. Not to be mistaken for William Defoe, the actor who played Count Orlok, who was pretending to be Max Schreck, who was playing Count Orlok in Shadow of the Vampire. If that was just a bit confusing, you need to see the movie. It is one of my favorites. The Flying Dutchman was not a pirate ship. It had nothing to do with pirates. The pirates of the area around the Caribbean were gone before the Dutchman made his voyage. Captain Heinrich van der Decken had managed to acquire his own ship by 1941 after years of working under other owners. His was one of the fastest ships on the ocean. It was said to be so fast it flew across the waves. Thus the name of Flying Dutchman. After marrying the woman of his dreams, he set out to the Far East in a bid to bring back spices and silks to earn enough money to buy his new wife a huge house. The 2-year trip was fraught with danger, from the pirates that plied the seas in and around the Mediterranean to the storms that rose up from the Southern Ocean. Captain Van der Decken had made this trip on a few occasions, and he had always wished that the Dutch had put in a port at the far end of Africa, so ships caught in the sudden storms would have a place to escape to. The Southern Ocean has some of the most intense storms on record, and the only way to get from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean was by way of this nasty storm-ravaged route, which took ships right past the Cape of Good Hope. The Cape got this name from sailors who just hoped and prayed they would make it around the end of Africa. The going was bad if you were sailing east, but west was a whole other problem. The winds and the currents were all going east. Cape Town wouldn't come into existence until 1652, 11 years after Vanderdecken had become a legend. Setting sail from Holland, Vanderdecken promised his wife he'd be back soon, with little difficulty. He didn't want his wife to worry. His wife, on the other hand, knew the perils of sea travel, and she began to worry before his sails were out of sight. The Flying Dutchman arrived in India with little trouble. The Cape had not been as bad as most times before. The Southern Ocean current flowed to the east and made sailing much easier when following the direction of the water. The plan was to spend a month or two purchasing goods to be transported to Holland and sold. As the owner and master of the ship, Vanderdecken was responsible for all of the business transactions. Meanwhile, back home in Holland, his wife was beside herself with worry. She fretted about what may have become of her husband. When no word of his arrival in India had come, she turned to other means of finding out. She found a slave who knew how to scry and put him to work. The scrying is a form of gaining knowledge by gazing across a reflective surface, like a bowl of water, to see what is to be seen. The slave told her her husband was in India and in good health. Unfortunately, one of the maids employed by Captain Vanderdecken spied on this evil activity, and she reported it to the authorities. The Inquisition had been halted in 1564. No longer were people rounded up to be tortured and then burned at the stake for witchcraft. But this didn't stop local authorities from trying and convicting witches on their own. Vanderdecken's wife was arrested and convicted of witchcraft. One of Vanderdecken's friends immediately dispatched a letter to India on the first freighter heading that way. It arrived nearly 2 months after her arrest and was handed to the captain. He was beside himself with anger. He had to get back home and stop the execution. According to the letter, his wife was to be burned at the stake in just a few months. She would have already been barbecued if not for her station in life as his wife. Vanderdecken dropped everything and set sail. He put as much sail up as he could. He yelled at his crew and he pounded on the rail. Any order not immediately fulfilled was met with harsh punishment. There was no time for rest. The Flying Dutchman was needed to live up to its name. As his ship began to round to the southern end of Africa, a storm came in. The winds and the seas were all blowing in the wrong direction. Captain Vanderdecken needed to go west, but everything was driving him farther east. When one of the crew suggested they turn back, the captain threw the man overboard and into the violent seas below. The rest of the crew were far more afraid of their captain than of the storm they faced. The captain began to pray to God to allow him to get around the Cape and home to save his wife. He had no idea the sentence had already been carried out. She was dead, and there was nothing he could do to save her. Not knowing this, he prayed with all of his might. The storm continued to make headway impossible. The ship was neither gaining nor losing any ground. And with that, we're going to pause for a few moments and play a couple of commercials, drink some coffee. Don't go away if you want to hear the rest of this exciting tale. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Good news for you coffee drinkers out there. The Organic Man Coffee Trike is back open once again. They're now located at 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. They're open 6 days a week, Monday through Friday from 7 in the morning until 9 o'clock, and Saturdays from 10 in the morning until 9 at night. Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Trike and tell Julio or Marta you want a cup of the best coffee on earth. Remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee.
We gotta say goodbye.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. When Captain Vanderdecken received no answers from God, he turned to the other side. He asked the devil to get him back home to Holland. He cursed his men and he cursed his ship. He was beyond his senses. He swore he would get around the Cape if it took all of eternity. He made a deal with the devil. Today, there are reports of sightings of the Flying Dutchman in every ocean on Earth. These are not the Dutchmen. The only place you'll find the Flying Dutchman is in the waters off the Cape of South Africa. All these other sightings are some other ghost ships. Captain Vanderdecken swore he was going to stay until the end of time. According to legend, he's still there. If you do see the Flying Dutchman, it means that the ship you're on is going to run into some very bad weather. There is a strong possibility it won't make it to sea the next day. A sighting of a square-rigger ship under full sail, tacking as if in a storm, even when the seas are calm, sends cold chills down any sailor's spine. If you do encounter the ghost ship, whatever you do, do not accept a sack of mail from the captain. This is the same as making a deal with the devil. The mail sack was destined for the home he would never see. You'll soon find yourself amongst a member of the crew. The Sargasso Sea is a region of the North Atlantic Ocean bounded by 4 currents forming an ocean gyre, a kind of a rotating mass of water that pushes everything in towards the center. The movement of the water works like a very slow whirlpool. Unlike all the other regions called seas, it has no land boundaries. It is distinguished from other parts of the Atlantic Ocean by its characteristic brown sargassum seaweed and often calm blue water. Sargassum. The sea is bounded on the west by the Gulf Stream, on the north by the North Atlantic Current, on the east by the Canary Current, and on the south by the North Atlantic Equatorial Current. a clockwise circulating system of ocean currents termed the North Atlantic Gyre. It lies between 70 and 40 degrees west and 20 and 35 degrees north. It's approximately 700 miles wide and 2,000 miles long. Bermuda is near the western fringes of the sea, and the Sargasso Sea is overlapping a major part of the Bermuda Triangle. All the currents deposit the marine plants and refuse they carry into the sea. Yet the ocean water in the Sargasso Sea is distinct for its deep blue color and exceptional clarity, with underwater visibility of up to 200 feet. It is also a body of water that has captured the public imagination, and so is seen in a wide variety of literature, in artistic works, and in popular culture. Just to make things a bit weirder, the water on all sides are rough, churning constantly as they crash about in their forward movement. As you come to the edge of the Sargasso Sea, the water suddenly becomes calm. It's kind of what you'll see as you pass through the eye wall of a hurricane. You go from a storm-filled sea to a calm area known as the eye of a hurricane. It's nothing as violent as a hurricane, but that's the best simile I could come up with. Outside the Sargasso Sea, the water is spinning like mad as compared to the water inside the sea. It is also a deep blue color as opposed to the green of the oceans. If you can get the seaweed out of the way, the visibility is very good because the water is clear and calm. As the oceans spin around this body of water in a clockwise direction, it pushes anything floating into the center of the calm waters. Things like floating trash tossed from passing ships to derelict ships and boats. There's little wind here, which can play havoc on a sailing vessel. As the sailing vessel approaches the Sargasso Sea, it almost looks as if they are approaching land. The seaweed floating on the surface looks solid. Back when all ships were at the mercy of the wind, sailing ships would find this area difficult, if not impossible, to maneuver. The forward motion would be brought to a crawl as the wind played out. Then the seaweed would pile up, causing the ship to come to a complete standstill. Once the forward motion was gone, rowboats would be lowered in hopes of being able to pull the ship forward. Well, the rowboats were in bad situation as well due to all the seaweed, making rowing nearly impossible. The Portuguese sailors first discovered the Sargasso Sea with its mat of seaweed in the early 15th century. The thick layer of seaweed combined with the lack of wind soon became a problem for all of these ships. They charted the location on maps so that future vessels could maneuver around it with as little risk as possible. Christopher Columbus sailed past this bizarre sea in 1492. He thought he had reached land until they were right on top of the weeds and they could see what it actually was. He was fortunate he didn't try sailing straight through the area. The Americas might not have been found, or at least not by the Europeans. It was originally believed the movement of the ocean current caused the Sargassum seaweed to be pushed into the calmer waters. Today, scientists have found that the seaweed is actually native to this area and grow here vigorously hundreds of miles from any shore. Although there are other such currents in other parts of the world, South Pacific and North Pacific, that too circulate around, there is no record of such thick formation of seaweed in any other area. With plastic used by everyone for everything these days, the trash being tossed into the ocean has drifted into the Sargasso Sea. Soon it'll look like a giant floating plastic heap. Sargasso Sea is located at the very east end of the Bermuda Triangle. Many mysterious vanishings have been credited to the triangle, when it is actually the Sargasso Sea that is the culprit. While large freighters and barges can steam through the area with ease, and the seaweed doesn't cause much concern, so there's no real threat to shipping, there have been many mysterious incidents that took place in this area. Back in the early days of ocean travel, up until recent times, there have been cases where ships that have vanished or gone missing have later been found adrift in the seaweed. Everything from small boats to large fishing vessels. In 1840, a French merchant vessel named the Rosalie was en route from Hamburg, Germany to Havana, Cuba. The route of travel took the ship right through the Sargasso Sea. The Rosalie was a cargo ship, 222 feet long. Now, there are some reports that say it displaced 222 tons, but this would have been a tiny ship in those days. It probably displaced something more like 2,000 tons. It was built in 1838 and had a full crew and several passengers and was in good shape. The ship never reached Havana. The Ellen Austin was an American schooner. It was a large multi-masted ship, displacing over 1,800 tons, and it was 210 feet long. The ship was manufactured way back in 1824 in Maine. She used to make runs between London and New York, but in 1840, as she was traveling through the Bermuda Triangle, when a lookout spotted a ship under full sail, slowly moving in a converging course. The Ellen Austin soon grew close enough to hail the other vessel. The captain tried to contact anyone on board this other vessel, but no one appeared on deck. This was very unusual in those days. Someone was always on watch, and then there was the helmsman. No one was at the wheel to keep the ship on course. It was decided to board the other vessel and see what was amiss. Perhaps the crew had become incapacitated by food poisoning. Not that uncommon in those days. And there was always a possibility the ship had been abandoned, in which case it was open for salvage. A boarding party was sent over to the derelict ship, which turned out to be the Rosalie. A boarding crew was made up of typical sailors. Back then, even as today, sailors were very superstitious. Abandoned ships were always a thing to be approached with caution. The Flying Dutchman is one such ship. Remember, if you see the Flying Dutchman, there was a very real chance the ship you were on was about to meet a catastrophe. Once on board the Rosalie, they searched the entire ship but found no one. There was no sign of any damage and no reason for the crew to have abandoned the ship. The ship's hold was filled with precious cargo, everything from textiles to grain. It would bring in a healthy cash crop, payment all by itself. The ship was also worth plenty, seeing as it was less than 2 years old. Having been abandoned on the high seas, this allowed the Ellen Austin to claim it as salvage. In order to salvage this ship, the captain of the Ellen Austin sent some of his prize crew on board. A prize crew was a select group that could function on their own. It was kind of a mini crew, usually made up of the first or the second officer and a helmsman, along with men who could handle a ship with limited manpower. These were not just greenhorns told to go. The prize crew would receive a healthy portion of the salvage money. They had to know their stuff to be on this crew. You had to have enough experience to handle a ship under any condition and any weather. The prize crew were usually some of the best sailors on board a ship. The captain of the Ellen Austin ordered the prize crew to man the Rosalie and make way for New York. The two vessels would sail in tandem. Late at night, a fog blew in, and the two vessels separated so as not to accidentally collide in the dark. They sat out the night, waiting for the sun to burn off the mist. As the sun came up, the captain called over to his prize crew that it was time to get under way. There was no response. He tried hailing them again, only to be met with silence. With an uneasy feeling, a second boarding party was sent over. A search of the entire ship was conducted, but the entire prize crew were gone. It was as if they had all jumped overboard in the dead of night. Now the story gets a little hazy. Well, hazier. A second prize crew was put together. This time, men had to be encouraged to go. You could say threatened. More money was offered. Threats were made. All the merchandise below decks, as well as the money to be made from the ship itself. The sound of getting rich outweighed the fears, and the second prize crew went over to take control of the mystery ship. I'd be willing to bet they were all a whole lot jumpy, and they kept an eye in every direction on board the ship. En route to New York once more, the two ships were making good time right up until a minor storm came up. Nothing the two ships couldn't handle. They went forward with visions of a huge payday. As the Ellen Austin broke loose of the storm, the Rosalie was nowhere to be seen. The captain figured they had been separated in the wind and the waves. He ordered the Ellen Austin to sail back and forth, looking for the missing ship. It was never found. The captain of the Ellen Austin was forced to continue on to New York, missing over half of his crew. I searched everywhere for more on this story. It sounds so much like the story of the Mary Celeste, only in a different part of the ocean. Some folks immediately yell, "Bunk! This never happened." For every naysayer, there are several positive reports. The Rosalie vanished in the Sargasso Sea, as well as the Bermuda Triangle, where the two overlapped. And with that, we are going to take another break, play a couple commercials. We'll be right back after this, so don't go away. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Coffee, nectar of the gods. And at the Organic Man Coffee Trike, you'll find coffee made the right way, one delicious cup at a time. Stop on by 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9, right across the street from the old Catula Pit. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
Though we gotta say goodbye.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio.
I promise you this. I'll
Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
every day in a letter sealed with a kiss.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. Getting back to the Rosalie. Yes, the mystery of the ship is still being explored. The crew of the Rosalie could never be traced again. However, in 1944, a retired British Navy officer, Commander Gould, wrote about this incident. In his article, he mentioned that the ship was actually found once again by the Ellen Austin, but again, like last time, there was no one on board. Either way, the Ellen Austin had lost too many men in this bizarre fashion. The crew, being terrified by the disappearances of the two prize crews, decided a third was not worth risking. They left the ship and made full speed to New York. 1855, the bark James B. Chester was spotted adrift in the eastern portion of the Sargasso Sea. The ship was found in serviceable condition, but without any sign of the crew. The table had been set for dinner. The food was still on the plates. Several of the chairs were tipped over as if the crew were in a great rush to escape some unknown threat. The stories of ghost ships must have been at the forefront of everyone's mind as they took possession of the ship and got under way. The crew of the ship that found the James B. Chester managed to sail it back to England for salvage. Fortune was smiling on them because they made the recovery and the consequent trip unhindered. A search of the records for recovered ships didn't find any mention of the Chester, but seeing as so many ships were lost and recovered in those days, it could have slipped through the cracks. The name could have been misspelled, misentered in a logbook. The date of the salvage could have been entered wrong, or the records could have been destroyed during World War II. There are numerous reports of sightings of abandoned ships stranded in the Sargasso Sea. As time ticked by, the ships would slowly lose their struggle and slip beneath the waves, joining the other ships already sitting on the bottom. The Sargasso Sea was the fictional location for a movie called The Lost Continent. The 1968 version, the 1951 version, which became a Mystery Science Theater 3000 episode. No, the 1968 version was just a little too far out there for Mike and his robot friends. It was so bad, I've managed to watch it 3 times, and I read the book. The movie was based on a book called Uncharted Seas by Dennis Wheatley. I don't like talking bad about anyone's best efforts, but the book is just a little bit too racist. Back in the 30s, this was the norm. It is not a bad read, but you must keep an open mind as to how people thought back then. The book was worth reading, but the movie, well, not so much. That's why I watched it 3 times. I have a thing for bad movies. Plan 9 from Outer Space and Blood Beach, just to name a few. The movie starts out with a funeral at sea. And then it jumps back in time to a ship breaking away from the customs folks in some far and distant harbor. The captain is in a hurry because he has an illegal and dangerous cargo on board. Naturally, he never bothers to tell his passengers they were sailing aboard a possible bomb. The ship is filled with people who would fit right into any modern-day soap opera. Everyone has several or ulterior motives for being on the ship. They run afoul of a nasty storm and they're forced to abandon the ship. Yes, leave a huge ship filled with explosives to face a hurricane in a lifeboat. Then, surprise, surprise, they run into their old ship now trapped in the seaweed. Monsters come out of the ocean to consume various members of the crew. Then people come traipsing along using balloons to walk on the seaweed. A group of 15th century descendants living in ships all trapped in the Sargasso Sea try to feed the crew to an undersea monster they worship as a god. Really a weird but cool to watch movie. Kind of like Troll Hunter, that classic movie from Norway. Now, in all this was a Hollywood piece of fiction, but the scenery would have been close to what sailors would have seen passing by the Sargasso Sea back in the old days of sailing. There would have been the twisted wrecks of ships trapped in the seaweed, sticking up like something from a nightmare. Some of the wrecks would never have lasted to the 20s or 30s. The sea would have swallowed them a long time ago, but still many would have remained afloat. The idea of a sea filled with lost ships was passed about amongst the maritime community long before the Bermuda Triangle was discovered. Derelict ships had been seen by sailors as they passed by the Sargasso Sea. It must have been far creepier than we can possibly imagine. There you are, standing on the deck of a ship, being rocked by the waves, with the snap of the sails being buffeted by the wind. As you stand watch, the water just a few hundred feet away becomes calm, as if it belongs in a different dimension. The seaweed is so thick it looks more like land than water. Dozens of ships are trapped in the weeds, their masts sticking up at odd angles, their tattered sails hanging down with no sign of any wind. If you look close, you can see the skeletal remains of the crew laying about the deck. Not a living soul was to be seen. Being a superstitious lot, the sailors would have believed they were seeing into hell. How could such a thing exist? The best course of action would be to get as far away as possible. Once back on land, any mention of the bizarre scene would have been met with disbelief and ridicule. As more stories were being passed around the waterfront, the tabloid press was quick to jump on these stories. They printed lewd articles with illustrations drawn by artists with a whole lot of imagination. One paper printed an article from an eyewitness who had spotted an old slave ship. The sailor said he could see the deck was covered with skeletons. Some of the crew and others were the slaves. The ship had become trapped in the weeds, and every effort had been taken to attempt to free it. Even the slaves had been used to try to break free from this floating graveyard. In another article, a witness claimed to have seen an old Roman trireme. How the witness knew it was Roman and not Greek? Maybe it was due to the number of oar decks. The Greeks had just one oar deck, while the Romans had 3. Once again, the so-called experts will say, the Romans and the Greeks never made it out this far into the Atlantic Ocean. This is based on their notion of, I don't believe it, therefore it never happened. Good, clean scientific research. Could a Roman ship have survived so long floating in the water? Just maybe it had become suspended out of the water by the seaweed. With such calm weather and stagnant water, the wood, which was treated against water damage, just might have lasted long enough to be seen by a sailor just over 500 years later. Most people were under the impression the Sargasso Sea was there long before the Bermuda Triangle came into being. The triangle was there as long as anyone can remember. The Sargasso Sea has been there just as long. The two have probably been here as long as the planet we call home. No one had managed to give the place a name until the 60s. That's when the name Bermuda Triangle came into being. The ships vanished into the triangle were just gone, whereas ships becoming stranded in the Sargasso Sea, they were still there for anybody passing by to see. The two bizarre areas of mystery are overlapping, so ships disappearing into either one could be and would be attributed to both. On occasion, a ship having its crew snatched from its deck as it passed through the Bermuda Triangle could have then drifted into the seaweed of the Sargasso and become trapped. No one ever thought to drag a camera out to the edge of the sea and capture photographs of the unearthly scenery. Today there are plenty of photos of the weeds, but none of the ships are visible. 1887, Commander C.D. Sigsbee of the U.S. Navy began a survey of the Sargasso Sea. He was documenting the ships trapped in the weeds as a navigational aid. With only his eyes as a means to avoid a collision at night or in the day, the survey was to be plotted on navigational nautical maps to help ships avoid running into these floating wrecks. For reasons of his own, no photographs were ever taken. None that we know of. Maybe in some dark government archive is a pile of old black and white pictures none of us are ever allowed to see. The survey took 7 years. During that time, Commander Sigsbee documented 1,628 shipwrecks visible inside the weeds of the Sargasso Sea. Steps were taken to determine the origins of these vessels. 160 wrecks were found to be United States register. 134 ships were listed as being out of Britain. There were also French, Norwegian, Swedish, and Russian ships mixed in with the floating graveyard. Since the Sargasso Sea wasn't stationary, these wrecks would move along with the seaweed. They would slowly drift in the same clockwise direction. This movement was taken into consideration when plotting their locations. Some ships managed to stay afloat for years and circled the entire sea several times. The Fanny E. Woolston held the record for lasting the longest in recorded time. The Woolston was a 3-masted lumber schooner which was abandoned off the Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, in 1891. Why the crew decided to jump ship is an unknown today. Perhaps a storm or some other motivation came up. She was observed by dozens of other ships over the next 3 years. The Fanny E. Woolston drifted away from where the crew had last seen her. For the first year, it kept going almost due east, and then it went southeast. For the next year, she drifted in circles in the mid-Atlantic before drifting west again. This would have been a cash cow of a salvage if anyone had tried to board her and sail to the nearest harbor. Any ships coming close enough to identify the Woolston quickly identified it as a ghost ship, and they did their best to steer clear of what was now known as a cursed vessel. The ship did one more loop before drifting north and east, finally seeming to ride the current of the Gulf Stream, before finally being sighted for the last time on October 21, 1891. It is estimated that she drifted almost 9,000 nautical miles before she finally disappeared. Sigsbee wrote that he could see no less than 19 derelict ships drifting around the waters of the Sargasso Sea at any one time. There's no way of knowing which ships were abandoned and then drifted into the seaweed, and which ships wound up trapped in the Sargasso Sea, only for the crew to die from starvation or exposure. The use of the lifeboats was out of the question. Since the ship itself could make no headway, the smaller boats were trapped as well. The 7-year study listed 1,628 ships. The Sargasso Sea has been out there capturing sailing vessels for thousands of years. Just how many ships wound up spending their last years adrift in the weeds is anyone's guess. Some say maybe as many as hundreds of thousands. How many men and sometimes women died having their last view of this world as a gray-green swamp of sargassum weeds? Of all the reports I came across while researching this show, I never found one where a ship or its crew escaped from the green death of this weird sea. I hate to think at some point in time the crew of one of these trapped ships spotted what looked like rescue coming close along the perimeter of the gyre, only to watch as the rescuers turned and sailed away, in fear of some otherworldly curse befalling them as well as the ships already trapped. As far as crews of those passing ships knew, the drifters were ghost ships, cursed by some evil element in this area. Any members of the crew seen waving in an attempt to draw the rescuers in would be deemed to be ghosts or even demons, trying to capture the still living sailors in the seaweed as well. And with that unhappy note, we're going to take a break and play a couple of commercials, so don't go away. We'll be back with more on the Sargasso Sea. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. And if you're looking for that greatest cup of coffee on the planet, stop on by the Organic Man Coffee Trike. Tell Julio or Marta you'd like a cup of the best coffee on the planet. That's right, the Organic Man Coffee Trike is now at 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9, right across the street from the old Catula Pit. If you don't know where the old Catula Pit was, it is about 2 blocks north of the Danny's on McPherson. The southern Danny's, not the northern one. The Organic Man Coffee Trike. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
Though we gotta say goodbye.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio.
I promise you this. I'll
Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
every day in a letter sealed with a kiss. Yes,
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back. Now, Commander Sigsbee went on to command other vessels in the U.S. Navy. He was the commander of the USS Maine when it exploded in the Havana harbor, sparking the Spanish-American War. The story of the Spanish sabotage causing the Maine to sink was a headline-grabbing story put out by the newspapers owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Hearst had sent a reporter, Frederick Remington, to report on the war in Cuba, and to start one if there wasn't one to report on. His opposition, Pulitzer, the owner of the World newspaper, said the only lunatics would believe the Spanish had anything to do with the sinking of the Maine. But he went ahead and printed stories of how Spain was responsible and they should be punished. The vitriolic stories printed by these two led to the United States declaring war on Spain and the subsequent death of thousands of soldiers and sailors, all in the name of selling newspapers. We will have to let the story of the war between the U.S. and Spain for another night. Now back to the Sargasso Sea. Marine creatures use the Sargasso Sea as a breeding ground. Turtles and eels live under the dense covering and use it to escape the clutches of predators until they grow large enough to no longer be on the menu. Birds use this floating mass as a rest stop while looking for fish to eat. It also makes a nice stop-off while flying between the continents. Wahoo and tuna feed on the thick seaweed. It is a ready source of nutrition, which is easy to find and abundant enough to sustain them. The added benefit of no fishermen trying to ply this part of the ocean makes life there good for sea creatures. Even humpback whales stop by for a feast. Unfortunately, while the ocean currents bring in lots of marine plants, it's this area the same currents also bring vast amounts of garbage from the other parts of the ocean, including the non-biodegradable plastics. This is the main reason for the initiative taken up by the Bermuda government to conserve and protect the Sargasso Sea. The American eel spawned in the waters under the thick layer of seaweed. Once the eel's eggs hatch, the tiny eel catch a ride on the ocean currents and use it to find their way to the fresh waters in and around Maine. Even though they are spawned and hatched in the salt water, they migrate to fresh water, the exact opposite of the salmon that are spawned and hatched in fresh water and then move off to the ocean. The American eel grows to about 4 feet long and about 20 pounds. The European conger eel grow as big as 10 feet long, and they weigh 240 pounds. They also spawn and hatch in the thick seaweed of the Sargasso Sea. If you read the book The Loch by Steve Alton, he has a rather interesting take on the whole Loch Ness monster creature. I'm not going to spoil the book for you. If you want to know what his ideas are, you're going to have to read his book. That's The Loch by Steve Alton. Richard Sylvester of the University of Western Australia has associated the mysterious disappearances of ships and aircraft in the Bermuda Triangle with the Sargasso Sea. Vast amounts of seaweed accumulate at the center of the sea where the powerful currents slowly circulate, creating a huge whirlpool. Sylvester came up with the theory that the huge whirlpool of the Sargasso Sea is like a centrifuge. This huge whirlpool creates smaller whirlpools that travel out and they reach the area of the Bermuda Triangle. These whirlpools are strong enough to rotate a ship and drag it inside. These small whirlpools cause many cyclones in the air. These cyclones continue the spiraling movement of the water from which they appear and may thus make small aircraft crash into the ocean. Then, John Hutchison has a theory about the Bermuda Triangle that is both interesting and it kind of makes some sense. His theory is the Bermuda Triangle and the Dragon's Triangle are connected by a wormhole that transports ships and planes from one side of the planet to the other. Any ship vanishing from the Bermuda Triangle can be found at the bottom of the ocean, only over on the Japanese side of the planet. It works both ways. The ships and planes vanishing from the Dragon's Triangle will wind up on our side of the planet. Think of any mad scientist from a movie and you're thinking about John. He has so many electronic devices in his apartment, there's no room to walk. He sleeps on top of one of his machines. What does this have to do with the Bermuda Triangle? He has managed to produce some of the magnetic anomalies found in the triangle. His experiments into electromagnetism have unintentionally produced every phenomenon reported in the triangle. The term Hutchison effect has become a moniker applied to all of the peculiar and startling effects his plethora of machinery can produce. Bruce Gernon, his father, and one other passenger flew through a swirling cloud formation that he likened to magnetic fog. It clung to his plane as if magnetic, and it affected all of his instrumentation. December 4th, 1970, Mr. Gernon flew from Andros Island in the Bahamas to South Florida. His plane arrived in Florida 30 minutes too soon, and he still had most of his fuel on board. Everyone on board the plane had a wristwatch that all showed the same time, 30 minutes less than the actual time. Bruce believed he had flown through some kind of a wormhole. John Hutchison has been able to recreate just about every electronic anomaly experienced while in the Bermuda Triangle. Being one of the few scientists even looking into some of these findings, John's theory should be looked into. He's also looking into the Philadelphia experiment. You should have heard about the Eldridge and how it was transported from the Philadelphia shipyard to Norfolk, Virginia back in 1943. Well, John Hutchison is working on recreating that teleportation as well. Among many other things, Allende, who first broke the story of the Eldridge, claimed that a greenish fog or a mist appeared around the vessel during the experiment. Then a hole in the water appeared, outlining where the hull would have been were it visible. How does this tie into the Sargasso Sea and the Bermuda Triangle? How about the idea there might be some kind of an electromagnetic storm being generated naturally, and this is the cause of all those ships and planes simply vanishing? Kind of like the movie The Final Countdown from 1980 with Kirk Douglas. The trouble with the Sargasso Sea and the Bermuda Triangle is right now there are no answers, only more questions. Yes, the scientists have come up with dozens of answers, which just about all fall apart as soon as you try to answer all of the weird occurrences with their scientific answers. I did write a book called The Triangle. It's about a fictitious ship that runs afoul of the area. Check it out at Amazon.com. That's Triangle by Chris James. And those of you that just might be hoping and wishing and praying that I would do the book about the strange things, well, I have finally finished my last endeavor into the bag company. The book called A Christmas Nightmare should be out soon. And since I'm wrapping that sucker up, I will now be focusing on writing the book about the radio podcast Strange Things. So hopefully, if I ever find enough time to do more than one thing at a time, the book Strange Things with Chris James should be out hopefully before this time next year. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, be sure and tell your friends to listen in. Let them know what they're missing. You can also find us on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, TuneIn, Podomatic, and Podcast Junkie. We're starting to show up everywhere out there. So look around, see what you can find, and be sure and tell your friends. Till next week, this is Chris James.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.